Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. And today I have a very special episode for you. By the way, I'm Rebecca Larson. Recently, I decided to put a call out on social media to ask people for what questions they might have about the Seymour family, because as many of you might already know, I have studied the Seymours for quite some time. But really, my focus has been on Thomas Seymour. But today, we're going to talk about the Seymours and some of the questions you have. So one of the first questions was basically about the lineage of the Seymours. So let's talk about the Seymours. Their story goes way back, like all the way back to the Norman Conquest in 1066. According to legend, a guy named Seigneur de Saint-Maur was part of William the Conqueror's crew when he landed in England. But if we're looking at solid historical records, the first real mention of a Seymour, or Saint-Maur, pops up in the 13th century. So, a little later. That's when a William Saint-Maur held land in Monmouthshire, and he struck a deal with his brother-in-law, Gilbert Marshall, that ended up taking the manor of Woundy from the last Prince of Gaunt. So this agreement even featured the coat of arms that the Seymours became known for, those distinctive golden wings. And that's how we know we're on the right path. Now, the Seymours weren't just lucky, they were smart. And over the years, they made some really strategic marriages. One of the most important was in the early 1400s, when Roger Seymour, the great-great-grandfather of Sir Thomas Seymour, married Maud Estermy. This was a huge deal because Maud's father, Sir William Estermy, was a big player at court, serving Princess Blanche and Queen Joan, and even sitting on Henry IV's council. When he died, Maud and her sister Agnes inherited a fortune, which massively boosted the Seymours' wealth and status. Now, by the late 1400s, the family had secured another important position. Sir John Seymour inherited the hereditary wardenship of Savernake Forest in Wiltshire. Now, he and his wife, Marjorie, now these are the parents of Thomas and Jane and Edward, he and his wife, Marjorie, settled at a grand manor house just outside the forest, a place where their descendants still live today. And this wasn't just any job. It actually put the Seymours right in the path of royalty. Henry VIII loved hunting, and Savernake was one of his favorite spots. That gave Sir John a perfect opportunity to get in the king's good graces. But even before Henry VIII came along, Sir John had already made a name for himself. He was knighted on the battlefield in 1497 after proving his bravery at the Battle of Blackheath. So this was during the reign of Henry VII. Later, he fought for Henry VIII in France and was rewarded with prestigious positions like Knight of the Body and Groom of the Chamber. His loyalty to the Tudors paid off, setting up his family for even greater success in the next generation. So if we look at Sir John's marriage to Marjorie Wentworth in 1494, Marjorie came from an impressive family. Her father, Sir Henry Wentworth, was a member of Parliament and held important positions in Norfolk and Suffolk. Even more interesting, the Wentworths could trace their lineage back to Edward III. That little drop of royal blood may not have seemed like much at the time, but it later played a role in Jane Seymour's rise to becoming queen. So how did the Seymours really climb the social ladder? Well, it was a mix of smart alliances, valuable land, and being in the right place at the right time. Sir John's great-grandfather had already built up the family fortune by inheriting lands from the Estuaries and the Beauchamps. But the real game changer was securing Wolf Hall, an estate that would forever be linked to the Seymour name. And, well, we all know what happened next. Jane Seymour became queen, and her brothers Edward and Thomas shot to the top of the political world. But that's another story. Now, somebody asked me about the history of Wolf Hall, and that could be a whole episode on its own. But to be honest with you, from the research that I've done, I've concluded that the first Seymour to really reside at Wolf Hall and be a warden of Savernake Forest, which kind of came with the domain, was Sir John Seymour, the father of Jane, Thomas, and Edward. Now, back when Sir John inherited it from his father, it wasn't the grand palace that it would become later in the Tudor era. So back then, it was probably something much more modest, but it grew into something quite spectacular. Now, over the years, I've been in contact with the archaeologist on site at Wolf Hall. I've also visited Wolf Hall and got my own little insight into the lay of the land and how things might have looked. One of the things that Graham Bath taught me was that by the time of Edward VI, and likely before that, Wolf Hall was no longer really a manor. It was considered a palace, and he calls it the Palace of Wolf Hall. Now, something that's so interesting to me is that they say it really was modeled after and looked a lot like Hampton Court Palace. So if you've ever been to Hampton Court Palace, you have a pretty good idea of what Wolf Hall used to look like. To give you an idea of size, it had 2 courtyards. It had a gatehouse with a room above, just like Hampton Court Palace. It had a great hall, 2 galleries, a king's chamber, a great chamber, a broad chamber, family rooms, a nursery, over 30 beds. It had a chapel, a treasury, an army, evidence room. It had a tower. It had servant quarters, and it had a garderobe. Now, it also had a dairy, stables, kennels, a great barn, all different kinds of things, including 8 orchards. And I've always been fascinated by the number of orchards at Wolf Hall. It also had several gardens. During my visit there, what remains is not the Palace of Wolf Hall. What remains is something that is a combination of Georgian and maybe Stuart, but it does give you a feel, at least the property, to be able to stand there and kind of look out over the land and imagine. But there's a working farm next door that is on the land where this palace would have landed. And so that makes the archaeology work a little bit more difficult because they're unable to get to the places that they need to due to the farm buildings. So Wolf Hall Manor, as we've all known it for so long, really turned into a palace. Can you imagine the size Wolf Hall became? If it were like Hampton Court Palace, it was huge. And that really says something about the status of the Seymour family during the Tudor era. As time went on, of course, Edward Seymour, the eldest surviving son of John and Marjorie Wentworth, inherited the place after his father's death. When Edward Seymour passed away from execution, his eldest son, another Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, inherited it from his father. But unfortunately, for quite a few years after, Wolf Hall was virtually unlived in by the Seymour family because Edward Seymour spent a lot of time in the Tower of London due to his relationship with Catherine Grey. From there, it just got handed down over the centuries from one family member to the next. And the family that currently resides there are indeed descendants. Another question that I got from a listener was about Anne Stanhope, so the wife of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. And what was her relationship like with Mary I? And what happened to their family during the reign of Mary I and Elizabeth I? Well, I've kind of alluded to what happened during the reign of Elizabeth I with the imprisonment of Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. So we can kind of leave that there. But as far as Anne Stanhope and Mary I, it's interesting because after the death of Edward VI in 1553, Anne Stanhope, now Dowager Duchess of Somerset, kind of found herself in a complicated position under Mary I. Anne, of course, had been Edward's wife, who was the Lord Protector during Edward VI's minority. However, after her husband's downfall and execution in 1552, Anne fell from political favor. She was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London, but later released. And when Mary I came to the throne, Anne's position was somewhat precarious. Though she had Protestant leanings, she was not as deeply entangled into the Protestant cause as her rival, the Duke of Northumberland's family. In fact, Anne's daughter, Anne Seymour, married John Dudley's son, John Dudley, making her indirectly connected to the faction that had supported Lady Jane Grey's claim. Now, despite this, Mary I showed Anne some favor, and Anne retained her wealth and estates, and she continued to have precedence at court. She later remarried, but she never regained the influence that she once had as the wife of the Lord Protector. But she managed to navigate Mary's reign without severe repercussions. Now, during the reign of Elizabeth I, things were a little bit different. At least under Elizabeth I, it was okay to be a Protestant or have the reformist beliefs, because now she was aligned with Elizabeth and her religious policies, which likely improved her standing at court. Anne had retained significant wealth and lands. Her children, particularly her son Edward, whom we've talked about, caused some controversy in Elizabeth's reign. His secret marriage to Lady Catherine Grey, a claimant to the English throne, resulted in royal displeasure, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Though Anne had a reputation for being fiercely protective of her family status, there is little evidence that she played an active role in her son's political troubles. Despite the turbulence of the early years, Anne lived well until Elizabeth's reign, passing away in 1587, and by then, she had outlived many of the political figures who had shaped her life, including both of her husbands, most of her rivals, and Queen Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, whom she had reportedly disliked. So when it comes to the scandal, this is always a question that comes up when I ask people what they want to know about the Seymours. And the biggest thing is the scandal, right? What really happened? Did Edward Seymour's first wife, Catherine Falal, have a relationship or an affair with his father and have a child or children with him? So this is an interesting one because, of course, we will never know for certain. There is no way to know for certain. Even DNA testing would prove difficult because we have a father and a son involved in this. So I did a little research on this a few years back, and I'm going to touch base on that now. Okay, so in 1514, Edward Seymour married Catherine Falal, and until Edward reached 21, the couple were to live at Wolf Hall and would be fully provided for. This was pretty common for the time. That same year, Edward was part of Princess Mary. This is Henry VIII's sister. He was part of her household, and he was a child of honor at her marriage to Louis XII of France in October 1514. So this is where the mystery kind of begins. Surrounding this story, there is so much confusion when it comes to Catherine and Edward. Let's begin with their age. The History of Parliament online states that Catherine Falal was in her 20th year when her father settled his estates in 1527. Why is this important? Stick with me. If 20th year meant that she was 20, then she was born about 1507 and would have been about 7 years old at the time of her marriage to Edward Seymour, an age that was no longer lawful to marry. If they meant that she was in her 20s, then that opens it up much wider, and she could have been the same age as Edward when they got married. Now, when we examine the couple's marriage agreement, it becomes clear that something caused both of their families to agree on a specific term. That if Edward would, quote, disagree with the marriage, within 3 years, Sir John Seymour would pay 200 marks for for Catherine's next dowry. 3 years after their marriage would have been 1517. And if Catherine was born in 1507, unlikely, her young age may explain the verbiage in their marriage contract, but does not explain why she would have been 11 years old when she had her first child. So marriageable age for girls was 12, with the age of consent being 14. And this is a standard that many of you know that was set up and established by Margaret Beaufort. In 1518, the couple welcomed a son and called him John. Sometime after the birth of their second son, Edward, rumors abound that Sir John Seymour, Edward's father, was in fact the biological father of John. Now, some have stated that they think it's possible since Edward had been at university and Catherine was at Wolf Hall without him. While facts are obscured by gossip, it is clear that Catherine Falal ended up in a nunnery. It's also clear that she, her husband, and heirs were disinherited as co-heirs of her father's estate. Something that has been made clear to me is that it wasn't only Catherine as co-heir who was disinherited, but also her sister and husband. Sir William Falal took every precaution to ensure that they never received their inheritance. But in 1530, his will was set aside by an act of Parliament on account of his having many sundry fantasies in his later days. Catherine and her sister then shared their rightful inheritance. But what caused the fallout with their father? Had he merely gone mad, or was he provoked? In 1674, Peter Heylin is the first to mention the story of Edward Seymour in France. While in the service of the king in France, Edward had acquainted himself with a seer who foresaw an event between his wife Catherine and an unnamed gentleman in a familiar posture. Heylin also believed that Edward Seymour's eldest son by Catherine was Edward, not John. So from the start, we have some incorrect information there. Horace Walpole also mentioned how a handwritten note was spotted in the margin of Vincent's Baronage in the College of Arms, a book of great authority, which was published in the 17th century, that Catherine Falal was, we'll translate this from Latin into English, is roughly translated into divorced because his father, after the wedding, she knew. Walpole lived in the 18th century and likely had access to both works. In 1527, when Sir William Falal disinherited his daughters and co-heiresses in his will, he said, quote, "First, my very will and intention for my many diverse causes and considerations, me moving that neither my daughter, Dame Catherine Seymour, nor her heirs of her body, nay, Sir Edward Seymour, her husband, in any wise have any parts or parcel of my said manor, lands, tenements, and other premises." Also, she was to receive £40 annually for life, as long as she live virtuously and abide in some honest house of religious women. If my said daughter do not live virtuously and abide in some honest house of religion of women to the pleasing of God, then I will that my said daughter have no parcel of the said 40, but the said executors do depose thereof towards the performance of my testament and last will and other good deeds of charity. So this would indicate that in 1527, when he made those stipulations, that Catherine was already in a convent or nunnery. Where were her sons? Did they stay at Wolf Hall with their father? Or is historian David Loades correct in the assumption that they stayed with their mother? At some point prior to March 1535, Catherine Falal died. Sir Edward Seymour married Anne Stanhope on the 9th of March 1535. Anne Stanhope had made sure her husband only recognized the children that she had by him, excluding the sons by Falal. In 1540, she got her way. An act of Parliament was passed that disinherited John, the younger son of Edward. The younger son, Edward, was spared from the big paternity question, but he would not inherit his father's titles and land. That would go to any half-brothers by his father's second wife, Anne Stanhope. The only hope Edward could have imagined was if his father had no surviving sons, then he would rightfully inherit everything. After Sir William Fallal made mention of his grandsons in his will, the trail goes cold on John Seymour for about 2 decades. There's no indication of a wardship for either John or his brother Edward, and David Loades believes that this means they were with their mother until her death in 1535, and then their care reverted to their father. Is it possible that they stayed at Wolf Hall with their grandparents while their father was at court? If, like Loades says, they had stayed with their mother in the nunnery, the loss of records and gap in time would be explained.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Uh-oh. The last cookie.
You can get a new box of cookies in as fast as an hour with Walmart Express Delivery.
Are you my guilty self-conscience?
No, I'm the voice offering you promo code EXPRESS for free delivery on your first order.
Hey, who ate my cookies?
You mean, these cookies?
Order now. Welcome to your Walmart. Promotion valid for first express delivery order. $50 minimum subject to availability. Restrictions apply.
So, really, when it comes down to it, the question remains, did Catherine Fallal, Edward's first wife, have an affair with her father-in-law? As you have noticed from this episode, there's some contradicting evidence. So really what it comes down to is, what do you believe is true? How do you interpret this evidence? Considering it's not in the history books until the 1600s, it leads me to believe that it is just another way to villainize the Seymours. Much like Thomas Seymour, after his death, for centuries, has been villainized. He's the bad guy, right? In this case, Edward Seymour is the bad guy. He was executed. I'd honestly like to know what you think of this whole thing. Maybe you want to dive into the research as well. Look up some of the people that I mentioned in the research that they've done and tell me what you believe to be true. When it really comes down to it, we're never going to know the truth. There is no way, unless somebody finds a diary, which at this point I don't believe is going to happen. But my research into the Seymour family has taught me one thing. It's that you look at the evidence and then sit back and analyze it and figure out who benefits from this information. Is it true? Could it have been fabricated? If it is true, where is the evidence that points directly to the truth? I hope you've enjoyed this quick little episode on the Seymours. I know I didn't answer all of your questions today, but I'm hoping to do another episode in the near future for you. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time. And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.